All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight to talk about this important topic about instruction and Act 20. And I'm super grateful to be here. My colleague Sarah is on the call too, so I'm grateful to have her here. And Barb, thank you for taking the time to help our educators and our leaders in the state clearly understand what this Act 20 is all about and what should it look like for them in their schools. So just take a minute to introduce Barb here. Barb has more than 20 years of experience supporting reading and literacy development in Wisconsin, including as a reading teacher, a literacy coach, and more than a decade working in DPI. Bless your heart, right? Focus on literacy. She is a believer in building systems of support, student learning, maintaining asset-based approaches for each student, and developing educator expertise. Dr. Novak will lead the DPI's work on implementing the requirements of Act 20 and the 2023 Wisconsin Act 20, which reimagines the way Wisconsin students are taught to read. She was appointed in the role after a rigorous application and interview process and in consultation with the Early Literacy Council. So my name is Jeanne Schopf. I serve currently as the president here in Reading League, Wisconsin. And thank you, Barb. Go ahead and get started with our talk tonight.
Thank you for that warm introduction. To all of the anonymous folks out there, either those of you who are tuning in tonight while you're eating dinner or putting your kids to bed, or those of you who are watching the recording, thank you for taking the time to continue to learn because that helps you better serve students and their families. I need to just get organized here. Are you seeing the slide deck?
Looks great.
Thanks for that confirmation. I'm just gonna try and make sure I can also see the chat here. All right, buckle up because I have a lot for you in the next 20 minutes. We are talking about curriculum
Hey, Barb, wait, can I have everybody make sure put some in their chat, like what school they represent? That would be great, and who you are. That'd be great. Thank you.
Yep, of course.
I think you could get started while people are doing that.
Okay, I appreciate that.
No problem.
All right, we tonight are talking about curriculum, instruction, and Act 20. So we're going to start by grounding ourselves in the big goal, like what we're really doing this for. And then we're going to move on to the statutory requirements. And you can see the different statutory requirements that we will have time to touch on tonight. I just want to remind you what a big part of the role of the Department of Public Instruction or our equals in other states. Part of our role is to empower schools and districts to make local decisions that meet or exceed federal and state law. What does that look like? That looks like clearly explaining federal and state law, what the requirements are, supporting schools and districts in being sure that they are in compliance. And a thing that is important within our particular Department of Public Instruction is that we are ensuring that all of our efforts are focused on addressing disparity, particularly disparity related to race, ability, and language status. So you will hear me clarify what's in the law. You won't hear me say, unless the law says it, you won't hear me say, you must do this, or you must do this, or you must do this. Instead, I'll review what the requirements are and plan that supports you in making your local decisions. So let's start with our big goal. Our big goal is that every kid is able to read by the end of grade 3, and that means every kid. I would also personally like to say that every kid is a reader by the end of grade 3, which for me would mean that they're able to read, but also that they identify as a reader and that they understand the ways that reading can support them, both in learning and their life. How do we get there? we get there by developing an equitable multi-level system of support. Taking a systems approach to strengthening early literacy ensures that we are meeting the needs of every student, and that we are doing that as a system by things like engaging in strategic use of data, which is where the screening requirement and the diagnostic assessment requirement of Act 20 fits in. And I would also like you to I'd like to push you to think about improving early literacy overall, with making sure that you're meeting the requirements of Act 20 as part of that. Act 20 is incredibly comprehensive, but there are some places where your system may already be doing better. For example, family and community engagement. Act 20 situates parents, caregivers, as recipients of information, recipients of screener scores, recipients of diagnostic scores, signators on the personal reading plan. But we know that many schools and districts already have really robust routines that treat families as true partners. Every family is literate. Every family is their child's first and best teacher. And so that's an example of how we can think about early literacy broadly while also meeting the requirements of Act 20. And as much as me, and I think many of you in this room, would like to see reading as the only school improvement priority, it's not. Schools are also working on belonging. Schools are also working on comprehensive school mental health. They're also working on addressing federal identifications, which may be related to attendance or math achievement or any other number of factors. So just really acknowledging that improving early literacy is one of the many improvement efforts that schools and districts are engaged in. And our work tonight, talking about curriculum and instruction, is really going to zoom in on a strong universal level and a continuum of supports. You also see some other things, some other key features like evidence-based practices that are a critical part of curriculum and instruction. I also want to ground us in DPI's model for reading comprehension. I will remind you that this is only for reading comprehension, which is only one of the 9 elements of science-based early literacy instruction, but you'll see other elements of the remaining 8 components embedded throughout the model. So first, I want to acknowledge that all of the work that we're doing with students has its foundation in social emotional learning, choice and access, interest and relevancy, and metacognition. So if we think about this as a table, the table itself includes metacognition, interest and relevancy, choice and access, and social emotional learning. So then we start to set the table, put the dishes on, put the food on, have our family join us at the table. As we're doing that, we are working on developing fluency in context, language comprehension, and strategic knowledge. In the simple view of reading, we know that fluency in context and language comprehension result in reading comprehension. Fluency in context in particular is developed through a series of sequentially developing skills. So that's where we get at systemic instruction. And we also see the different areas of language skills that need to be addressed and cognitive skills that need to be developed, such as setting a purpose, a general purpose for reading, a specific purpose for reading on a certain day or for a certain assignment, strategic reading behaviors, comprehending strategies, and strategic knowledge. So this is just another reminder that our big goal is kids that can understand text, kids that are readers by the end of grade 3. So let's start with science-based early literacy. You saw many of these things reflected in the previous slide, DPI's model for literacy instruction. And science-based early literacy instruction does include all of these areas. You can click on the link in the slide for more information, particularly about phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, and phonics. Those are pretty specifically defined in the law. All of your Act 20 needs every single one of them can be met on the DPI's Act 20 website. You see the link on the top of the slide. It's an active link. And the things that we're talking about today related to curriculum come out of the section on the side that says resources for Act 20. When you get there, you click on curriculum, and that's where most of the information I'm sharing tonight is coming from. So the requirements about curriculum and instruction that are included in Act 20 apply to universal or core instruction and intervention. And they are applicable in kindergarten through grade 3. They include the explicit and systematic instruction in 9 areas of science-based early literacy, and they include the prohibition of 3Qing. So I'm going to go through specifically what explicit instruction is, what systematic instruction is, and what it means to prohibit 3Qing. I already showed you the slide that has the 9 areas of science-based early literacy. If we had more time tonight, we could go into more depth about that. I also want to remind you that the requirements of Act 20 are not the only requirements that schools and districts need to meet when they're thinking about curriculum, instructional materials, and other resources that they're using. There's also applicable federal and state statute. Big things like pupil non-discrimination, things like Act 31, which is about teaching for pluralism, including American Indian studies, Native Americans, Indigenous folks, and as well as Holocaust education and Southeast Asian education, including Hmong. So first of all, the first question to ask is your curriculum and materials, your curriculum and instruction in alignment? Being in alignment means that you are providing explicit and systematic instruction in the 9 areas of science-based early literacy without using 3Qing across universal instruction and intervention. The law does not say that you have to buy a curriculum to comply with that. And it is possible to buy a curriculum and not comply with that. For example, you can buy a curriculum, not learn how to use it, and not implement it with fidelity, and you could be out of compliance. We do offer a curriculum crosswalk tool that lays out the 9 areas of science-based early literacy and provides you with an opportunity locally to think about what are you doing for explicit instruction in each of those areas, and what are you doing for systematic instruction in each of those areas. That might help you realize where you have some weaknesses, ways that you need to supplement. There is a component of Act 20 that allows for partial reimbursement for up to 50% of purchases from the Early Literacy Curriculum Council list, and I'll talk more about that list at the end. That money is not available. It is stalled because of a lawsuit. The money won't become available until the lawsuit is resolved. For those of you who are watching this online, in the recorded version, what I'm saying is true on October 24th of 2024. There is a way for joint finance to release the money, and DPI has presented with them with that proposal. And to date, they have refused to schedule a meeting to approve giving the funds to DPI. So let's dig into explicit instruction. Explicit instruction happens through an instructional framework that includes clear, memorable, explicit teaching of the desired skill, guided practice with positive corrective feedback, precise language that enables the student to complete the task successfully, and the instructional framework leads to self-regulated independent application. So all of that is also layered on top of good teaching. So we start by naming the learning target. We provide some rationale for the learning target. Perhaps that's happening by connecting it to past learning. Perhaps that's explicitly telling students how understanding this learning target will support them as a reader. Next, the teacher demonstrates the skill or strategy to be learned. You might think about that as sort of an I do phase, where the teacher has 100% responsibility for the task. It's critical that the learning target is actually explicitly taught. So we're not putting students in a situation where they have to infer or generalize what they're supposed to learn. The instruction is explicit. Next, there's a we do phase where the teacher and student, or perhaps students, are working together to practice the skill. This is a time when we can expect there to be a lot of errors. So if students are practicing together, there has to be an opportunity for a knowledgeable other to give those students feedback on how they're applying the skill. Again, it's a time where we expect a lot of errors, and we're working on providing just-in-time feedback to make sure the student doesn't continue to practice the skill in ways that are incorrect. You start to move through that process, releasing students into a phase of instruction where they are responsible for doing the thinking. So at the beginning, the teacher is 100% responsible for doing the thinking. And at the end, the student is 100% responsible for doing the thinking. For some kids, if we're doing word work, that might mean that there's a step that involves decodable text as a really controlled environment to practice that skill that they're working on developing. But the ultimate goal is that students are able to independently apply what they're learning in any text, and also, in the case of encoding, be able to independently apply what they're learning in their own original writing. As part of this process, we are intentionally teaching for transfer. So that's allowing students to take things from the real controlled exercises that we're doing in the classroom into their practice, and allowing them to apply that skill the next day or the next week or the next month. In addition, those transfer opportunities also need to be really intentionally planned for between intervention and universal instruction, especially when the intervention is delivered very separate from what's happening in universal instruction. We can't assume that anything is just going to happen on its own. We are making very explicit and very intentional teaching choices to be sure that the student is developing the skill. When instruction is systematic, it is intentionally teaching identifiable skills within a scope and sequence. That scope and sequence might be provided by a purchased curriculum. That scope and sequence is definitely related to how we know that language develops. So what you see on the screen right now is a scope and sequence for phonological awareness. And then there's even a separate scope and sequence, as you already know, for phonemic awareness. Students typically develop through these skills and these skills in a sequential manner. They're not necessarily discrete phases. Like there's not going to be a single day where a student magically moves from word awareness to rhyme recognition. They might seem like they have it one day and need more practice the next day. They might be ready to move on to a little bit of repetition and creation of alliteration, where they're also still trying to become secure in rhyme recognition. But the choices that we're making are based on the scope and sequence, our knowledge of our students, and the data that we have to support the decisions that we're making. You can also find a scope and sequence or a support for systematic instruction in the standards. This is a screenshot from the Wisconsin Standards for English Language Arts, specifically the section that is about reading foundational skills. So you see the kindergarten standards for phonics and word recognition at the far left, the grade 1 standards, and the grade 2 standards. And you can actually trace those standards to see how they develop from kindergarten through grade 2. This is only one page. There's also grades 3, 4, and 5. And these are end of grade level expectations. I would ask myself whether or not having just end of grade level expectations is enough to really have the scope and sequence. Generally, a scope and sequence and systematic teaching goes into more detail, such as specific standards and parts of standards that are taught in a given lesson or a given month. So there generally is more detail than what's included in the standards. I just want to put a plug in for a DPI resource from the pandemic days, which is specifically about explicit and systematic instruction in phonics. So you can see what the webinar topics are on the screen, and each webinar defines explicit and systematic instruction for each of the skills, and it provides at least one instructional strategy with examples from Wisconsin classrooms. Act 20, specifically Wisconsin State Statute 118.015, also includes the prohibition of 3Qing. The statute specifically defines 3Qing as any model, including the model referred to as meaning, structure, and visual cues, or MSV, of teaching a pupil to read based on meaning, structure, syntax, and visual cues or memory. This definition is not unique to Wisconsin. There are other states that are using this same definition, and I think you can see very clearly from the definition that using MSV as your model for teaching students to solve words, whether it's words in isolation or words in text, is prohibited by statute. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. If both of the following questions are true, then the curriculum intervention or supplementary instructional resource likely does not violate 3Qing. So if these two questions are true, the resource most likely does not violate 3Qing. First of all, does the curriculum intervention or supplementary resource follow a specific scope and sequence? The scope and sequence, particularly for foundational skills, is an indicator that students are explicitly being taught how to solve words. Students would never have to guess at a word or look at the picture or skip the word and go back, because the curriculum includes a scope and sequence that is giving them the skills they need and the practice they need and the feedback they need to correctly solve words. Number two, does the curriculum require the learner to apply their knowledge of phonics to solve an unknown word? Part of this is ensuring that we're teaching for transfer, that we are explicitly teaching for transfer. As we're teaching word solving skills at the individual word level, we have to also be teaching students how to apply that when they're reading connected text and giving students feedback on how they're applying what they know when they're reading connected text. So if we're thinking about using phonics to solve an unknown word, we're definitely teaching kids how to explicitly do that. Not just how to solve the word, but also how to apply that while they're reading. We also have to take a hard look at the kind of cues that we might be giving a student when they encounter a word that they don't know. That's what cueing is really about, is helping students develop this internal system in their head of what they do to solve a word they don't know. Our cues need to be about the letter sound relationship. So we might say things like, what's the first sound? What's the last sound? Get your mouth ready to make the first sound. So the cues that we would really be giving the student are reinforcing that letter sound relationship. And when we're reading with the kid, it's just a really beautiful time to be able to choose just the right thing to say. As a teacher, you know the patterns that that kid already knows. You know how they're applying them in their writing. You have a solid understanding of who they are as a reader right now, and you can prompt for that, with those prompts being about the letter sound relationship. So when does this 3Qing have to be gone by? Effective July 21st, 2023. So like last year, the date the statute was signed. No purchasing of materials that include 3Qing. Can't be state funds, can't be federal funds. For the 24-25 school year, no use of 3Qing. If you have instructional materials that were previously purchased that include the 3Qing, it is acceptable to use the materials, but you may not use the parts of the materials that are about 3Qing. That might look like purchasing a supplemental resource instead of purchasing an entirely new curriculum to make sure that you are teaching students to solve words relying on the letter sound relationship. 3Qing does only apply to the letter sound relationship. Teaching vocabulary is something very different than teaching kids how to decode words. And there are absolutely situations when we're trying to figure out a word's meaning or trying to figure out the nuanced ways that an author might use a word when it is completely appropriate to refer to the context. But vocabulary instruction is a different thing than decoding the word. The other thing related to curriculum and instruction that 118.015, again, that's the state statute, did was create the Early Literacy Curriculum Council. It is a group of 9 individuals, 3 appointed by the Senate, 3 appointed by the Assembly, and 3 appointed by DPI. They serve staggered 3-year terms. The only responsibility of the council is to create an annual curriculum list. So there is a list already in existence for 2024. It's been out since early in the year. There will be a new list published for 2025. It sounds like that new list will include at least one additional resource. The council hasn't quite finished their reviews yet. Their materials aren't due until early December, so they are doing great. They are on track to meet that deadline. So everything that was approved in 2024 will stay, unless a curriculum goes through a major, it's not called a renovation, a revision. Unless the curriculum goes through a major revision, it would not be removed from the list. If it goes through a major revision, it would have to be resubmitted and reviewed over again. Everything you want to know about the council is on this slide. You could use, if you want to review materials on your own, you could use the rubric that the council provides for vendors. And you can also view the ratings of the council for all of the materials that they reviewed in 2024. When they're done with their materials for this year, they'll also post the reviews for all of those materials. So it's a very transparent process. Again, you don't have to buy anything off the list. There's a possibility that you would be reimbursed up to 50% of the purchase price if you do buy off the list. And there's some details there, like if you bought in the year 2024, it has to be from the 2024 list. And if you buy in the spring of 2025, it could include any of the things that were added to the list. But if you were to buy something that was added to the list, if say you bought in 2024 and then that thing got added to the list in 2025, it's not eligible for reimbursement because it's based on the date that you purchased the materials. So our goal in all of this, why are we following all these details? Why do we care about all these details? Why are all of these details important? Because they are meant to support us in developing systems that are going to ensure that every kid is a reader by the end of grade 3. I want to go back to the slide with all the requirements in it. So tonight we talked about what it means to be in alignment, what it means to engage in explicit and systematic instruction in the 9 areas of science-based early literacy while not using 3Qing, And we've talked about the role of the Early Literacy Curriculum Council in supporting you to do that work. You have professional organizations like the Wisconsin Reading League, and you have your CISAs, and you have other professional development providers who are very knowledgeable and very able to share with you specific techniques or specific products that you could use to meet the requirements of the statute, which is a great time for me to hand it over to the Reading League president.
Thank you, Barb. That was great, comprehensive lay of the land presentation. And we are partners with DPI in this work. The mission of the Reading League, in sometimes we don't speak to what our mission is very often, but the mission of the Reading League is to advance the awareness and understanding and use of evidence-based, evidence-aligned reading instruction to improve literacy outcomes for all. So we are here as partners in this work. And I thought I would share a couple other resources along with what you shared to help guide conversations in schools and use to get around the table with people. So I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to see if I can find, make sure my sound is on, because I have something I thought would be really fun to share too. And here we go. So this document, this PDF, is from the International Dyslexia Association. So the term structured literacy was coined by them, I believe, around 2014, 2010-ish. I forget the exact date. And so why this matters is when we're talking about what explicit and systematic instruction is, right? And so in this infographic, and you can get this for free if you go to the International Dyslexia Association, you can get this infographic, download it free. That's what I did. And this would be really, really great for conversations with your team. So you can see just kind of what Barb talked about, right, is the curriculum in Act 20 deals with Tier 1, which would be your core, and your intervention, which would be Tier 2 and Tier 3. All have to have explicit systematic instruction in them and no 3Qing. And if we look at, and as Barb spoke to this, the different areas in which should be explicitly and systematically taught, right? We're talking about the what, right? So instructional content that integrates the domains of language as they pertain to reading, word recognition and comprehension, and written expression, handwriting, spelling, and composition. So when you look at what should be taught explicitly and systematically in your curriculum, we should have the phoneme grapheme connection, the alphabetic principle. There should be morphology, syllable types, orthographic conventions, as well as vocabulary, background knowledge, sentence structure, grammar, text structure, and critical thinking, all integrated in your lesson. So as you peruse through your curricula, just think about, okay, what does it mean? What parts of reading have to be taught explicitly and systematically? And then the how, right? The essential principles of instruction guide how content is taught in both reading and written expression. So these principles are beneficial to all students and are very necessary for struggling students. So what do we mean? So direct and systematic and towards mastery. So I know in my work with schools, and maybe Sarah can speak to this too, is we're getting some really good explicit systematic instruction, but we're not always making sure that students are getting those skills mastered. And for some of our kids, right, they need multiple repetitions in order to get mastery. So just keep in mind, your atypical reader, 1 to 4 exposures, according to the research David Scher has done, David Kilpatrick, right, the brain will automatize that pattern, and the readers will be able to read that word and spell that word. But guess what? That's only about 30% of your students in 1 to 4 exposures. So you're talking 60 to 70% of your students need multiple opportunities to practice that pattern, okay, throughout the tiered approach. So we want to make sure that we are mastery orientated, okay, and that we are constantly getting around that data, right, to make sure that we are finding out which kids are mastering and which kids are not And as Barb spoke to, we want to have targeted corrective feedback. That's a really big difference. And you can get that with small group instruction. It's highly active, interactive, and scaffolding, right? There's a lot of scaffolding to support kids in order that need that greater intensity. Your instruction, your curriculum should be explicit. It should be sequential. It should be cumulative and multimodal. That you can notice the term is not in there, multisensory. The term now that is being used in IDA is multimodal, which means you see it, you say it, you write it. You see it, you say it, and write it. So one thing that you really want to be watchful for is there enough of that multimodal practice for all of our kids to gain mastery? And some kids are going to need more than that. Sarah, did anything you want to add on to that?
No, you covered it well. Thank you.
Okay. All right. And of course, I cannot not end a night if we say, really, what is explicit instruction? Is to share this great video with you. Then you can find this too. It's a great teaching video by Dr. Anita Archer about what is explicit instruction. So let me know, thumbs up if you have some volume here. Can you hear it?
So I have the gift today of talking to you about explicit instruction. Explicit instruction simply is instruction that is quite direct. It is unambiguous with the goal that the students would get it, would understand it, and would learn. We have a lot of confusion around the term explicit instruction, so let me sort of augment and add to that. One question I'm often asked is, wouldn't it be more motivating for students to learn it on their own, to discover it, to use authentic problems to discover it? And it's as if we have set up a total dichotomy between explicit instruction and discovery, but we really should view it as a continuum. And when we look at the research on instruction, we learn what are the attributes of that continuum. For example, if you are teaching children that are novices, that have just never learned this body of knowledge in the past, it appears that they do much better if we explicitly teach them the information, whether it's knowledge or skills or strategies, that we teach it. If they are learning a body of knowledge that they've not learned in the past, they're brand new to algebra, they are new to decoding of words, then they really benefit from very explicit instruction. So those two things, when the student is a novice, when the knowledge is new, explicit instruction would be desirable. But then after you've gained lots of information, you've gained lots of skills, then discovery is much more a viable option, but only after you've had explicit instruction. So one of the things that I also would be reminded of is the research. If you happen to be a special ed teacher, an interventionist, and you are working with struggling students, we definitely know that they are going to gain more with very explicit instruction than discovery. You know, if they had discovered it, they would not have been struggling. And so we need to have very explicit instruction for them. And what would that mean? Well, we could actually take explicit instruction and put it into two areas. One is the design of the instruction, and the other is the delivery of the instruction. And the design of the instruction means that we pick important content to teach them. We break it down into obtainable pieces, but then our lessons are organized so that more learning could occur. For example, I often talk about 3 major steps in teaching children skills and strategies, where I do demonstration, guided practice, checking for understanding. I do it, we do it, you do it. And many of the skills and strategies we teach would follow that pedagogy. But it also means that the students are not only directly taught it, but they have practice. And actually, I'm going to tell you, my concern is often that we're not giving adequate practice. I have constantly hear people say, well, you know, Anita, that is just drill and kill, drill and kill. And I can tell you, we have no reported incidents of children dying of practice. Instead, look at the research, the abundant research from cognitive science and from learning on practice. The students need deliberate practice where they're practicing with a purpose. They need practice that is spaced over time, not all in one session. And they need to retrieve information in that practice. So it's a combination of very explicit instruction with I do it, we do it, you do it, followed with deliberate and space practice and retrieval. But here's what I've noticed. I've had the great blessing of teaching for 52 years and do demonstrations all throughout every year. And what I have noticed is that students need better delivery skills than we've done in the past. For example, all instruction needs to be interactive. I say something, you say something, I write something, you write something. All explicit instruction would be very interactive with students actively engaged throughout the entire lesson. And we would give them, we'd monitor and watch their responses, give them feedback on the responses, and we would maintain throughout the whole lesson a very perky pace. So those are some of the attributes of having very explicit instruction. And we know that then I set you up for your ability to solve authentic problems. I set you up for being successful. I set you up to generalize information to other situations. But this means we got to keep the teach and teacher. And we have to provide the teaching that our students need. So let us never forget the research on explicit instruction. Because if learning is our goal, then a lot of explicit instruction needs to occur there. Bless you in your career. May you thrive as an educator.
That's a great video. You can find it, Middle Tennessee State University. Anytime you're talking to your staff about what explicit instruction is, she explains it quite well. And then I just want to circle back real quick, and then we can open up for questions, is this idea, and I know Barb spoke to it, as far as systematic, right? And so that systematic instruction right here under sequential, generally speaking, it's coming from the simplest skills to the most complex skills. And so when you're looking at your curriculum, right, mastering that alphabetic principle, then mastering those CVCs and silent E's, and then getting into that vowel pattern, and then getting into the multi-syllable words, and then getting into that morphology. So that is what you really want to be looking for in your curricula, that it has that systematic approach and sequential, and gives them, as Anita said, lots and lots and lots of practice. So Sarah, did you want to add on to anything? Are you good? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing. And then I know that we want to do a Q&A, have an opportunity. People want to unmic, ask questions. If you don't want to unmic, ask questions, drop them in the chat. Barb is here. So anything can be, and if you wanted to rewatch this or share this with your staff, it will be on our YouTube channel. So at this time, I am going to find the stop recording button.
As Jeannie's doing that, if you haven't paid attention to the chat, the graphic that Jeannie mentioned is in there. Barb placed it in there. The YouTube video from Anita Archer is also